Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tamanna Enus. I'm a liaison officer at UKICIS, and joining me today is Inaya Rakhmani, who is a lecturer in communication science and the director of the Asia Research Centre at the University of Indonesia. She's also the deputy director of the Science and Education Working Group of the Indonesian Academy of Young Scientists. Hi, Inaya. How are you today?
Hi, good, Tamanna. I hope you're well as well.
I am well. Do you want to start by maybe introducing yourself and your research?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Inaya, and by training, my PhD was in Asian studies, but I minored in media studies. So I looked at how media and communications are part of larger changes in society. The center focus of my research in the past 10 years is actually the constitution of everyday power. So things that could enable us or marginalize us in daily settings and larger political settings, like our gender, our religion, our ethnicity, our ability to speak in different languages. All those play into the way we can gain some upward mobility. So I look at everyday experiences and also high level settings like the politics of elites. So that's a little bit of my background and what I study.
And how did you get to the position you're in now, being the director of the Asia Research Centre?
That's story of coincidence maybe, but in social sciences, we don't believe in coincidences. Um, Around 2012-13, I was finishing my PhD thesis, and I was a bit bothered by the fact that not many good articles and sound, rigorous monographs are written by Indonesian scientists in social studies. And then I found several books that were talking about this. It's about social sciences and power, and how different politicians and different regime have contained critical thinking in Indonesia and actually in the larger Southeast Asian region. When I read those books, I noticed that if we meaning our generation of social scientists, we were to do anything serious with our work and the best quality there is, then we would have to know how to use our resources and be able to look at ourselves as social beings within a larger structure. I've been writing about this in the past 10 years, and this goes into my activism as well. That's why I'm part of the Indonesian Academy of Young Scientists, and we're working with people from various backgrounds, from engineering, from medical sciences, from bioengineering, so many people from different backgrounds with the objective, the common goal of communicating sciences and making it relevant for as many people as possible. So I've been writing about that a lot. And with that underlying value, me and my peers and I and Universitas Indonesia formed a research center so that we can do longer term research. And it's currently being funded by the government and also various sources of donors. And it's with this in mind that we thought to cooperate with Nottingham and with Universitas Gadjah Mada, and we're looking at interdisciplinary collaboration as well. So that's a bit of what's been happening in the past 10 years.
Geothermal energy project. So that's a collaboration between academics in the UK and Indonesia through UKICIS and GCRF. And it's aiming to find geothermal resources in Indonesia. So what would your role be in this project?
When we talked about the project with our colleagues, especially in UGM, because the first step is actually collaborating transdisciplinarily, because interdiscipline, we being social scientists, we can talk with people from the humanities, a linguist, an anthropologist, a political scientist, etc. But it's another thing if we're trying to collaborate in really different fields and different faculties and different paradigms and ways of even carrying out research. So the talk was quite extensive. First of all, as a social sociologist, the first task is to understand the context of research carried out by the geothermal scientist. What is the characteristic of the local setting in which they're carrying out research? Understanding the process in which data is gathered, and also who's using the data in that place. What are the hindrances? Who's supporting the project? And the people supporting that project, where are they based in? Is it private companies? Is it government actors? Which part of the government, etc. So this creates kind of like a social map of actors that might hinder or enable a process of sustainable energy. And this is the angle that I'm looking at when I'm contributing to the project, because any invention can only be of use when the community and reformist government officials are actually on board to have it and monitor its commercialization by a private company. So there needs to be that account and balances process, and that's actually a social setting. So the main framework that I'm using in all of my research is also present in this geothermal collaboration that we have with Nottingham as well.
You mentioned collaboration as well. In one of your articles that you wrote about Indonesian policy not being maybe supported by quality research, you said that there isn't an international presence of social scientists, Indonesian social scientists. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's maybe a lack of motivation to collaborate, or do you think there's not enough opportunities to collaborate for social scientists in Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was the same question that I had 10 years ago. And after conducting several research, we found that the structures of bureaucracy, because Indonesia used to be a centralized authoritarian government. It used to be managed by an authoritarian regime for decades, for at least 33 decades, 32 years. And this is how the ministries are structured and the way budget is allocated, and that includes research budgets. And when the research budgets goes into universities, the research itself are carried out by civil servants, workers whose promotion mechanisms are measured by state promotion mechanisms. It means that the kind of excellence that UK institutions, higher education institutions in the UK and the US and Australia is not present during that phase of democratization and commercialization that Indonesia went through at the late 90s. So lack of motivation, we think, in social sciences comes from the external factors that actually make us want to do something. That can come from a peer member, a friend. It could come from a clear pathway of career. It can come from a feeling of seeking for meaning and managing that meaning when we meet students. But when the organization is structured in a way that our achievements are measured by state approval, that becomes a problem. And even though there are various reform efforts by the government, it was instilled so deeply in those 30 years that we need a kind of um, egalitarian or horizontal collaboration with partners outside of Indonesia to increase our capacity within Indonesia. So that's a kind of way to overcome the bureaucratic hurdle by sharing knowledge and also carrying out capacity building by collaborating with our counterparts in other countries.
Indonesia wants to move towards maybe sort of a more research, knowledge-based society. But how do you think the best way the government and people in positions of power should go about doing that? Do you think they should start with international collaboration and, you know, interdisciplinary science, or do you think they should start from younger generations and building up from there? What do you think that their approach should be to that?
It should be ideally a systemic approach. For generations active during the 80s and 90s, collaborations and mentoring is still necessary if they are to become professors, for instance. And on a micro level or an individual level, or on among my generation, not having a mentor within our country needs to be cut. Uh, those with opportunities, with scholarships and studying abroad, and maybe staying there, like one of our colleagues, Bagus, in the UK, is a potential mentor for younger scientists in Indonesia. And that could also kind of curb that cultural barrier in which perhaps language could be a problem, or different cultural attributes or habits could be a problem. So that's another way to do it. So it needs to be systemic, and for the younger generation, more scholarships, more support, research support for early career researchers to carry out their own independent research, so they can build like a research roadmap that comes from their curiosity rather than a larger programmatic agenda from the government. I think these macro, meso, and micro level systemic changes needs to be done, and UKICIS is part of that. So I'm really happy to be part of this.
The benefits of having quality research in influencing policy making? Obviously, we know the disadvantages of it, but what are the benefits of actually having good quality research backing and legitimizing policies?
The benefit, at least in my field, is it helps with policymakers to look at problems that need to be addressed with policies and programs, not as something that needs to be addressed short term. With long-term research and academic research, especially those theoretically grounded, it gives a long-term vision for the policymaker to see an impact, or perhaps, for example, a social conflict that we are not experiencing today. But based on the theories that are present, that are available, also historical knowledge, the past 100 years, for instance, we can, in retrospect, we can look at that in long-term planning. And it's a process in which the academic and the policymaker needs to work together, so that all of the loopholes and blind spots are covered. And that's why interdisciplinary collaboration is also necessary, because not one scientist cannot solve that problem or give that insight, long-term insight, to the policymaker. It has to be a peer of researchers giving advice to policymakers so that they can minimize risks, and anticipate changes that might not be present today.
So is there an authority, a scientific authority, that overlooks the research that goes on in Indonesia? I know in the UK we have one. Is there an equivalent in Indonesia?
We did have a Ministry of Research and Technology. It will now be subsumed under the Ministry of Education and Culture. The idea is to have a more effective organization. That's the idea of the government today. And there's also the National Agency for Research and Innovation that overlooks all of the research and development in all ministries. So we're going through some changes now, but hopefully that wouldn't affect any of the existing collaborations that we have. So we do have an overarching body that looks at the whole research system in Indonesia.
And how involved are they in the research?
In the ministry, so there are sets of grants that they give out, and usually it's given out to universities on a competitive basis or also based on assignment. So some of the schemes are called decentralization. It's kind of like a capacity building for local universities. And there's also national priority research agendas. So lecturers compete with each other to get the grant, and it's usually multi-year, so 2 to 3 years and 4 years at the very latest. The government or the ministry appoints a review board within each university or between universities to look at the proposal and the progress reports and the final reports and see whether the researcher achieve the outputs that they promised at the beginning of the research activity. And this is fairly new. It's been installed in the past 5 years. Before that, most of the research funding goes to universities and it's assigned between lecturers. And on some levels, competition can bring more quality, but I think based on various research, competition can also be disencouraging for those who actually do good research, but the research topic perhaps is not one of the government priorities. So this is an issue that I think is best addressed with a link between social sciences and engineering.
Can you explain more about maybe what social science is and the sort of importance and impacts it can have? So an example of an impact, it maybe research you've done and the impact it has had.
One of the uses or insights that social sciences as a large term can give is helping us understand the kind of social conflicts that are happening today and what causes them. Some of the very interesting researches that I think could use more public presence is studies about populisms, because it's happening in the US with Trump bans, it happened in the UK with Brexit, it's happening in Indonesia with Islamic populism. And the underlying question is, how come countries so different from each other with different levels of development and economic growth and different paradigms of governance? We have welfare states, we have open competition systems, but the kind of divisiveness, polarization, and the way people can troll online is very similar. Some research that have studied that in social sciences is the fact that in the past 20 years, the economy is more open. It's called neoliberal economy. And it's a blanket term that's often mentioned, but what does it really mean in a daily setting? It means that when we want to get good healthcare, we need to go to private hospitals. When we want good education, we need to go to private schools. When we want to get good water, something very basic in our daily lives, we buy it in bottled commercial water. Everything that we need to sustain is privatized if we want good quality. And this creates and shapes a kind of discontent between people who have access and don't have access. And it creates a kind of divisions based on race, based on religion, because it's much easier to accept feeling discontent to people similar to us rather than those coming from outside or someone coming from a different race. So it was very interesting, at least for me, to see how everything is actually very much connected, even though we live in very different parts of the world. And the research is being done on COVID and what it means to work from home, what effects do virtual meetings have on us, and what it does to our blurring of domestic and public life. These are basic questions just to understand our position in the world. And while it might not result in copyrights or patents, when it's done very, very well, it helps us understand who we are and accept the social condition we're in. Hopefully may turn things for the better, if that's not too much to hope for.
You mentioned COVID. How has your research been affected by it? You wrote an article about how women have been affected by COVID, especially female researchers. Do you want to expand a bit more about that?
A research that we actually, with my colleagues from the Indonesian Academy of Young Scientists, we carried out an exploratory study on female scientists during the pandemic. And we found that many of the gendered inequalities that exist before COVID is exacerbated by these conditions of working from home because of the kind of division of labor, gendered division of labor in homes in large cities in Indonesia. And we find that while gender equality policies and more scholarships for women and more funding goes into gender equality and gender empowerment, female empowerment, the norms have not fundamentally changed, meaning that when there is a sick child at home, and while the house has a double income, it's the mother who takes it on the load. And it's not an issue that can be addressed only by social awareness campaigns, etc. It needs to include women or caregivers, because some male academics also perform that caregiving role, such as in the case of the US, because some men who are caregivers in the 60s and 70s couldn't receive government subsidies because the rules only mention that it's available for women. The role of caregiving in society can be held by both men and women. The case in Indonesia, it's mostly held by women. It means that only 50% quota for women in top tier positions in university is not enough. But putting people who actually perform caregiving at home and mainstreaming that kind of practices in which when someone is sick, they take care of them. When someone's contract is due, they make sure that they have another job to go to, or at least write up recommendations and make sure that they have a social safety net or nowhere to go to do that. So we argue that while the pandemic is affecting women more than men, but it doesn't end with mainstreaming women in those positions. It needs to be ensured in the kind of caregiving policies that are actually carried out by some of these women during the pandemic, because they're just so used to doing it at home.
What sort of vision do you have for Indonesia in the future in terms of science and research?
My hopes for scientists based in Indonesia or Indonesian scientists based outside is that we have more space, social space, economic space, political space to mainstream good research, good collaborations that has a lasting impact, not only in our own country, but also globally. And I also hope that it's also based on strong friendships, meaning that if there are hurdles in the future, and there will be hurdles in the future, we have a social bond strong enough to adapt our research activities so that our purposes are achieved. So that would be my hope.
Yeah, thank you so much, Inaya, for joining me with the thunder in the background. It's been lovely speaking with you today.